Media at McGill is a hub of research, scholarship, and public outreach on issues and controversies in media, technology, and culture. Visit us online at media.mcgill.ca.
The print media. There are brave oppositional voices, The Guardian, The Independent in Britain, occasionally the LA Times, will do one or two strong pieces. But in terms of the corporate control of the media, I mean, the figure I like giving is that Rupert Murdoch, who is not just a television mogul, but also owns over 200 newspapers all over the world, that all Rupert Murdoch's newspaper editors, 230 or however many there are, supported the war in Iraq. When I made this point in Australia, where Rupert, as you know, is a sort of household word, one journalist said, well, I think you're right, 99.9% right, Tariq, but I think the editor of the newspaper in Tasmania was a bit critical of the war. I said, well, I'm glad to hear that. It means there's some progress is being made. That's very good news, I said, because, it shows changes in the air. If you then look at the way two other events, and because the world is dominated by these wars, were covered, you will see a similar process. The Lebanese war of a couple of years ago. When this war happened, I was in Brazil at a festival of literature. Toni Morrison, many other writers from the United States, and everyone came and said, we've got to issue a statement. It's unacceptable what the Israelis have done. So we signed a big appeal. All the Brazilian writers signed it. There were some Israeli writers. They signed it too. I mean, it was a very broad thing saying this is not the way to deal with it. And I remember reading all the press coverage, and I just said publicly at the time, this war is too well prepared to be a spontaneous response to the kidnapping of 2 or 3 Israeli soldiers by the Hezbollah. It can't be done like that. This is a well-prepared action. And this created a bit of a controversy. I thought it was quite a mild statement on my part, but people said, no, of course it's the Hezbollah provoked the war. Anyway, that was the overwhelming coverage in the Western media, that Hezbollah had provoked the war by kidnapping 3 Israeli soldiers. The fact that each side kidnapped the other side and they kidnapped them because they wanted 50 Hezbollah prisoners released, all these things get forgotten in the heat of the moment. But anyway, what happens? The war backfires, and we now know what happened. And members of Tony Blair's cabinet have said that within the British cabinet there was real anger and hostility to the war. But Blair overrode them because he and Bush had agreed and given the green light to the Israelis. And when the Israelis, who said they needed a week to go in and wipe out Hezbollah, couldn't do it in the first week, Bush and Blair said, have another week then. And the war went on unnecessarily, destroying a lot of the infrastructure around Beirut. And many buildings and many things which had been newly built were destroyed. Now, they still didn't succeed, and they finally had to pull out, and it was seen as a big setback, and this setback created a big crisis inside Israel, and there was a public inquiry. And at this inquiry, Ehud Olmert, the Prime Minister of Israel, testified before Israeli judges and said that we had been preparing this war for 6 months. Now, what was the coverage of that particular... In Israel, it was very big. It was a major admission. It was buried in all the newspapers who had headlined, the Hezbollah provoke war, etc. So you would have thought at least they would have put it on the front page. No, even in Britain, it was reported, but it was buried. And that then decontextualizes what goes on in that part of the world. And while on this subject, I want to say something else, which is that the coverage of the Palestinian tragedy is pretty bad in North America. Less so in Europe, but it's pretty bad in North America, to put it mildly. That anyone who tries to report on Israel or be critical of Israel is denounced. There is an active lobby in North America which systematically denounces people and attacks people as anti-Semites, or, as is often the case if they happen to be people who are Jews, of Jewish origin, as self-hating Jews. So you can't win. Either you're anti-Semitic or you're a self-hating Jew. So I often, when I'm in the United States, say to journalists from the New York Times, I say, I know your problems, guys, but if you compare with what is published in the Israeli press itself, in Haaretz, in Ma'arif occasionally, they are extremely critical, courageous Israeli journalists. Why don't you just reprint what the Israeli press is saying without comment? They still won't do it. They still won't do it. And you know, 2 weeks ago, some of the most distinguished Israeli novelists, some of them hardcore Zionists, like Abi Yehoshua, one of the founders of the Israeli Republic, issued a public statement in Israel calling on the Israeli government to open negotiations with Hamas and to stop torturing Gaza. These are Israeli novelists. Does it have any impact within the North American media? No. And I think this is a real tragedy because this does Israel no favors, because the situation in that part of the world is getting worse. And there are only two real solutions there. Either you have a single Israel-Palestinian state with equal rights for all citizens, either that, or the only other option, which doesn't seem to be a serious option now, but who used to be considered a serious option, is that Israel pulls back to the 67 frontiers, moves the settlements out, and permits the Palestinians to set up their own state without being overlooked by Israeli tanks, without having settlements in there, and without being divided into shriveled little Bantustans. That's the only two alternatives. Now, and many Israelis, I was at a conference in Rome 2 weeks ago with the former Israeli foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami. This is a guy who has served at the heart of the Israeli regime. And he said to me, you know, I said what I'm saying to you with him on the platform. And he said, you know, basically, I think you're right. There is no third solution. But I said, you're no longer the foreign minister, and maybe that's why. But he said a lot of people in Israel realize that there is no way out. But you know, you cannot get there without a debate. And I want to tell you another story about the courage of one Israeli journalist. About 3 years ago, a dozen Israeli pilots inside the Air Force, and just those of you who know what it means to be inside the military, it's very difficult to breach discipline. These pilots went public in Israel about 4 or 5 years ago and said, we are not going to go and bomb Palestinian villages. We are not going to bomb anything outside the 67 frontiers. And they were provocative. And they said, when we joined, we thought we were joining the Israeli Air Force and not some mafia outfit which embarks on revenge killings. Now, they were sacked, naturally, and they knew they would be. They were not only sacked, but they were denounced, traduced. They said, we are defending the best in Jewish culture, the right to dissent. It's part of our culture. And no one can tell us they are better Jews than us. We know what our traditions are. And the anger against them was so great that one Israeli journalist on the newspaper Ma'arif, his name was Yehuda Nuriel, which means he was a Baghdadi Jew.